This is the Honda GB350S, a brilliant little retro bike that's new for 2025 that we've been testing out for the past week or two. But look, is it actually better than the other bikes on the market, and is it the one that you should be spending your money on? Well, today I'm going to ride it over to my local dealer at Fowler's to check out some of the competition. We'll go through the pros and cons of each along the way, and then at the end, I'll give you my verdict. Now, there is a full review of this bike already up on the channel, but specifically for the purposes of this video, let's take a very quick recap of what I really liked about it, and also a couple of the limitations perhaps. Now, the number one thing I really do like about this bike is the looks, and while the details and the finishing is exactly as good as you'd expect from a Honda, what I think makes it is the overall sort of proportions with the oversized front wheel, the air-cooled engine, and also the shape of the tank and the seat. I think those are the things that have me looking back at it all the time when it's been parked up in the studio over the past couple of weeks. And you have to consider that in the context of the price, which is really rather good at £3,949 starting. Like I say, this is not a do-everything bike. There are certainly things that are beyond its capabilities, but when you consider just how desirable an object it is, and the fact that you can use it for getting around and still do quite a lot of stuff, I think under £4,000 is really, really very good. I also really appreciate the handling. I think the two things that are most important are the weight. It comes in at 178 kilograms wet, which is nice and light. And then also you get really good tyres, Metzler Turons Next. And so despite having relatively budget brakes, relatively budget suspension, an old school build, it's pleasant to ride out on the road. Fairly stable with a 19-inch front wheel. It might be a little longer than some of the competition as well, but all in, it still makes for a bike that glides along quite nicely. And I really appreciate as well a little bit of extra roominess when it comes to the riding position. So it's 800mm in the seat, which is a little bit more than most of the other bikes that we're going to look at when we get to Fowler's today. And so that just means it feels more substantial and therefore I think more comfortable, especially for longer rides. For someone of an average height like myself at 175 centimeters or 5'9", and certainly I'd expect above that. Limitations though, like I say, at 20 horsepower peak from this 350 air-cooled long stroke single, it's never going to be a bike that's going to carry you over different continents with loads of luggage. It's never going to be a bike to take to the track, and it's never going to be a bike to really raise your hair on twisty roads. I probably wouldn't want to do a great deal of motorway work either, and so realistically, to truly enjoy this bike, I do think it's in the majority limited to city riding and also a bit of B-road and quiet country roads where you can just waft along. On top of that, they can't throw the absolute works at it in terms of features at that price point. And so in terms of technology and rider aids and features, it's, of all the bikes we're looking at today, not going to be the most comprehensive. Now, you could say that actually suits the air-cooled, nostalgic character of a build like this, and I'd wholeheartedly agree. But if you do want more than, I think probably the switchable traction control is the most advanced feature on this bike, then you probably are realistically better off looking at something else. Now, before we get on to the next bike, I just want to say a massive thanks to BIKESURE for supporting the channel and making videos like this one possible. Specifically for our viewers in the UK, if you're looking at a new bike like one of these and you want to get the best possible cover, then we'd wholeheartedly recommend checking out the link in the description where you can generate a quote. Now, BIKESURE are a motorcycle specific broker with access up to 40, I believe, different motorcycle insurance schemes. And so they do all the work on your behalf to find the best possible deal. Also, on top of that, they really do aim to cover the widest possible range of bikers. And so whether you're riding a completely stock bike or
a custom or something you've modified a bit, or a classic bike, or even a grey import, BIKESURE will do their best to find you a policy. So once again, a massive thanks to BIKESURE for their support, and do check out that link in the description if you want to get a quote. Right, let's take a look at some bikes. Naturally, Enfield have got a lot of the 350 competitors, so that seems like a good place to start.
Undoubtedly, the Hunter 350 is the closest equivalent to the GB350S on the entire market. It's basically the same on price, very similar on spec, and the engine is about as close as it gets too. Again, you've got an air-cooled 350 single, making about 20 horsepower peak and just shy of 30 Nm of peak torque. To ride, I wouldn't say they're vastly different either, and so what might make you pick one over the other? Well, the Enfield may not quite have the same classic proportions, but I will say it looks a little more modern with the blacked out hardware, and there's certainly a better selection of vibrant paint jobs. One of my few criticisms of the looks of the Honda is that the choices of colour on the tank are all a bit safe and similar, with a black of course, then a flat grey, and a third choice of a very pale blue that's pretty difficult to distinguish from the aforementioned grey. Enfield, on the other hand, generally do a great job on all of their bikes of offering a nice selection of vivid finishes, some with graphics and some without, and so I'd say the Enfield is the one to go for if you want to stand out a little. Otherwise, honestly, I think I prefer the ride of the Honda, the slightly better finish as well, and also that extra height in the seat, but overall, I have to say, this is a very close one to call.
The other Enfield you might want to consider as well is the Meteor 350, which is very much the same as the Hunter, but more of a classic, cruiser style with a bit more chrome, a bit more fanciness to the finish, and naturally you'll pay a few £100 more for that. But also it's got quite a bit lower seat height. I think it's 765mm, and so I think of all of the bikes on the list today, all of the ones we're going to look at, that's probably the lowest seat height. For most people, I think the handling is a little more engaging on the, the more sporty chassis of the Hunter, but if you are short in the leg, then it's probably worth demoing a Meteor as well.
If, though, you want a little bit more speed, especially from a similar-sized engine, then realistically you're going to have to look for something that's liquid-cooled. That's exactly what you'll get, though, from the Guerrilla 450, which uses the same Sherpa single that was first seen on their Himalayan 450 adventure bike. The more efficient cooling means they can push it harder and rev it higher, which means pretty much double the peak power up at 40 horses and a more handy 40 Nm of peak torque. That means you've got a much more versatile bike that's quick enough for A roads and a bit of motorway, whereas the 350s, including the Honda, are much better suited to urban riding, back roads and B roads. The trade-offs, though, in my opinion, are twofold, with one being the canted forward engine and the lack of cooling fins, and just generally the styling on the rest of the bike, which mean you don't quite have the same timeless classic looks, but more so towards the modern end of the retro bike spectrum. Then there's also the price, about £1,000 more than the Hunter 350, which is absolutely understandable given the extra performance, but if you are on a super strict budget, then it might put this one out of reach. Now, next up, similar to the Guerrilla 450 but a little bit different, is the Triumph Speed 400. This one has been a great success since it was introduced last year, frequently topping the sales charts in the UK, at least for this category of bike, and it's easy to see why, with it being an absolute cracker that looks the business too. Like the Guerrilla, it's liquid cooled with about 40 horses and just shy of 40 Nm, but I'd say this one goes round corners a little better, owing to Triumph's handling know-how and perhaps better componentry. There's a radial bi-bray brake up front, a chunky 43mm upside-down fork, proper road tyres on the 17-inch cast aluminium wheels, and together they all combine for a bike that's really enjoyable out on the road. Then I'd say the looks are pretty good too, perhaps not quite as classically proportioned as the Honda with a more sporty forward slant, but certainly it has the attention to detail you'd expect from a Triumph and a feeling of quality to the build, despite what you might think about them outsourcing it to Bajaj in India. This is definitely one of the best bikes in this part of the market for me and strikes a great balance between modern performance and retro soul. The other bike in this lineup is the Scrambler 400X, which sits a little bit taller and has the more rugged looks, and it's definitely the better choice if you are a taller rider who finds the Speed 400 a bit too small, with some extra seat height and more open handlebars, giving it that roomier ergonomic. Then, if you did want to dabble in a bit of off-roading, then the 19-inch front wheel, extra suspension travel and semi-knobbly tyres will certainly help you do that, even if it isn't what you'd call a hardcore dirt bike. So another solid choice and another great seller from Triumph, but what I would say is if you're actually spending most of your time on the road, then definitely give the Speed 400 a go first, because it's far superior in its handling, as you'd expect, with the right ride height, the right wheel sizes and the right tyres specifically for riding on tarmac.
I should also add, recently in a news video, we looked at some spy shots of some potential upcoming new 400s from Triumph. So one that looks like a Thruxton 400, one that looks like a more jacked up XE version of the Scrambler, which looks like a more serious off-roader. And so while they do have, you know, the road and off-road side of things already covered, if you want something that's a bit more performance focused in either of those disciplines, then they might be worth maybe hanging on for.
Now, these two might not be the most retro-looking bikes in this part of the market, but I had to include them anyway, as they definitely have a cool aesthetic which I think will probably appeal to the same sort of buyer. The Vitpilen is the more road-orientated and sporty of the two, whereas the Svartpilen looks a little more rugged and Scrambler-inspired, but the underpinnings are pretty much the same, with both being based upon the KTM 390 Duke platform. For me, there are two reasons to consider these, with the first being the performance, again with a liquid-cooled single engine, but this time it's tuned for some top end rather than mid-range and torque, and so it makes more like 44 horsepower peak, and you can, if you're willing to rev it up, actually feel the difference. It all counts at this end of the capacity spectrum. Suspension is excellent too from their own brand WP, and you get some adjustability which is rare at this price point. Then, combined with the standard fit quickshifter, these are probably the most sporty bikes in this market, although personally I'd much prefer the Vitpilen's road tyres and lighter cast aluminium wheels to the semi-knobblies and spokes on the Svartpilen. The other big advantage of these two bikes is the tech, being some of the more pricey bikes in this market and perhaps having the more modern looks, which mean they can afford to introduce some more modern features like the TFT dash, USB port connectivity, riding modes, and switchable lean-sensitive traction control. So if you want a good-looking bike with a hint of retro influence, but also something that goes like a modern bike with modern levels of tech, then these two are pretty hard to beat. But over at Honda again, and one other option I wanted to mention is the CL500 Scrambler. This is the only twin-cylinder bike I could find at this sort of capacity and price point, and with a bit more capacity at close to 500cc, as you'd expect, it's way up on performance, certainly versus the GB350. It makes around 46 horsepower peak, 43 newton meters of torque too, and so again, that gives you a bit more versatility and confidence when it comes to covering distance at speed. It is, however, a little bit of an oddball with the looks, with I guess some retro influences and Scrambler styling cues, but also mixed with Honda's more modern design language, and so the result, I'd say, isn't quite so attractive or cohesive as something like the GB. That said, it's still a good option to consider if you want something with a bit more power, and while it's another bike that's pretty simple in terms of the chassis and tech, at $5,500 I think the price is reasonable enough, especially for something with the trusty Honda badge on the side of the tank. So, lots of excellent bikes to consider if you're shopping in this part of the market. It's certainly not a bad time to be doing so. But which ones would I personally go for myself before I run into the back of this bus? Well, I think having considered the options, I'd probably divide this one up into two categories. One of them being the more budget-focused end of the market, like this bike or the 350 Enfields, and they're all, $4,000 or below. all 350 singles, all air cooled, all about 20 horsepower, and really very similar, apart from maybe the Meteor standing out for the super low seat height. That bike's a little too low for me, and so I'd put it down to this or the Hunter. And if I was on a really tight budget, I'd find it very hard to resist picking up this Honda. I just prefer the way it looks, the level of finish on it, and also the handling stands out a little bit for me, and the extra room in the ergonomics. Then you've also got, you know, the $5,000 and above bikes where you get liquid cooling and stuff like that. And I think out of those, for me, the one that does it, the one that I've enjoyed the most, has been the Triumph Speed 400. Sure, it's not the most feature-laden bike that we've looked at today, but I think a really good retro kind of straddles modern capability and performance with a bit of that old school charm, and for me, it just about does it the best of the bunch. I wouldn't say it's as good looking as this bike, but in terms of that extra versatility that you get from 40 horsepower, the way the chassis feels, it's a really fun bike to ride, and also still having a little bit of that Bonnie inspired charm. Yeah, I think it's hard to beat.
As always, let me know which bike you picked down in the comments below, and also I'll put on the screen now our full review of the GB350S, which we published a couple of weeks back, so you can check it out in full detail in case you haven't seen that one already. Do hit subscribe for more of the latest motorcycle reviews like this right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.